Thank you all for coming. Sorry that we decided to, well, happen to have this on one of the coldest days this week, but what else would you be doing? So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Krista Ehlert. I'm an assistant professor with South Dakota State University. And I also serve as the state extension rangeland specialist. So I get the pure blessing of being located off campus at our Rapid City office, live in Spearfish, so kind of really enjoy my West River life. No offense to any of you from East River or elsewhere. And then today with me, I have my colleague, Dr. Jamie Brennan, and he'll give a little intro about himself in a little bit. And then Logan Vandermark helped me co-organize this workshop. And Logan, well, he's our offspring.
Yeah.
He's
Not little.
yeah. Jamie and I are great colleagues. We're not that. So Logan was our graduate student that we co-advised for his master's, and Logan is now in the summer of 23, he started with extension with SDSU as our precision livestock field specialist. So he's also located in our Rapid City office. And we kind of brought Logan on not only because of his research experience with virtual fencing and a lot of the precision ranching technologies that we have, but our SDSU Cottonwood Field Station, which is located kind of over by Wall, has really kind of turned into an epicenter of precision ranching technologies over the last 3 years. So we have virtual fencing. If you guys are familiar with CLOC, it's a Rapid City company, and they have things like green feed that measures methane emissions from individual animals as they go up to a bunk, and smart scales and a lot of other things like that. So Jamie leads a lot of that research and is pretty integral to making all that work. So today we're going to talk about successes, trials, kind of the nitty-gritty of virtual fencing. How many of you obviously have heard about virtual fencing, but how many of you have kind of like actually dug deep on it? Okay. So we're going to start with just kind of an overview of what it is, how it works, things like that. And then throughout the day, as you've seen on the agenda, Logan and I, when we pulled this workshop together, really tried to make sure that we had producer perspectives, but also, kind of sharing the research aspects that are ongoing, because that's going to ultimately inform, together with what producers you guys are doing on the landscape, what that actually looks like using virtual fencing at scale. We have several sponsors that we were able to secure for this workshop. They're listed at the bottom of the agenda, but Forest Service is helping us a lot with this workshop, as is Cattlemen's, the Grassland Coalition, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, South Dakota Sheep Growers, and TNC, the Nature Conservancy. So that's why we're able to have this workshop be free to you all. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jamie for some remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. I'd really like to extend a huge thank you for all the speakers today for it's scheduled to come here and travel to Rapid City and talk. I really appreciate all your effort that you put towards that. I don't, just looking around the room, show of hands, either Forest Service, Game Fish and Parks, NRCS, Rapid Producers, TNC, Ehlert, just looking at the list of sponsors that we had, just their diversity of people through. It's pretty amazing how much attention virtual fencing has garnered over the past 3 years that's been commercially available. I think there's a lot of people that have a lot of interest in it. A lot of times whenever we do extension talks, presentation, usually the one technology that everybody see the wheels spinning, see how they might utilize it on their operation or utilize their with that, it's not a perfect technology, and some of the things we'll hear today. Good side of it, how it works, and it works well, but also some of the bad side too, of the pitfalls associated with it. Krista and I are both working well. SDSU extension. And we really take seriously our role of extension. conduct research, do outreach on that research to our stakeholders, and make sure that our point of view is to provide unbiased information for our stakeholders. So that's hopefully what we put together today, a good overview of different perspectives on virtual fencing, and hear what are some things that work about it, what are some of the challenges. So people that are interested in implementing this, either on their management zone that you operate or personal, livestock production system, can have the best, most up-to-date information on how this technology works and is actually within your production. So I'll be moderating this throughout the day. For all our speakers, I'll just throw up 5 minutes, just so we try and stay on time. I know that they're kind of sticklers about when lunch is served, and they all get pretty hungry around 1 o'clock. So try to make sure we get that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Krista, who's going to be our first speaker. We're going to have talks, and then afterwards, we'll have a little bit of time for questions for our speakers, and then a bigger discussion about virtual fencing. So hopefully this is a good day, great learning opportunity for everybody present here, and don't be shy about asking questions if there's anything that's unclear. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. It is. Thanks. A few housekeeping things. Coffee, I think eventually will show up back there. Water's back there. Bathrooms are like to the left, as far as I know. We've got like really like advanced like Dyson things. So we're fancy folk today. And also just to kind of reiterate what Jamie said is there's, some of us researchers and extension specialists in this room that have our PhDs. But if there's anything that our jobs have taught us, like Jamie and I and Logan and others working with producers, is that they are smart as heck and truly some of the most innovative people. And so the other thing that we really hope today does is kind of elicit like a lot of ideas for, especially you guys as producers in the room or partners, if you have any ideas or questions that you feel like we as researchers and extension specialists can answer throughout our programs, please let us know. Drop by, get a hold of Jamie, Logan, or myself, and bend our ear a little bit. So the other thing, if you happen to leave early or are planning to, before we do the end Q&A, please grab me for the evaluation that we'll give out at the very end, but we just really like feedback. So with that, we'll get started. So how many of you go fishing? Okay. Can you get Wi-Fi on your fishing boat in the middle of the lake? Wi-Fi. Why are some of you shaking your heads? Yes, today is going to be really difficult for you. And hopefully it's not as difficult as the 15-minute conversation I had to have with my 70-year-old father that no, Dad, you cannot get Wi-Fi on your boat in the middle of the lake. So hopefully, if we can all understand that concept and that you need cellular service and therefore have to not be cheap and pay for a data plan, like my dad, then today's going to be like gravy. Are we good with that? Okay. So just to get everyone on the same page, why is this upset with me? I think we all know in the beef cattle industry, as well as those of us who work with livestock, is that we have fences because they dictate boundaries. 1 mile of fence, it kind of depends on who you're talking to, what agency, what producer, where they're located. But kind of the general feedback that we've gotten is that 1 mile of fence, like 5 strand, can be anywhere from like $15,000 to $25,000. So that adds up pretty quickly. Dr. Tong Wang is with SDSU in the Ness School of Economics, and she conducted a survey with almost 5,000 ranchers in Texas, North Dakota, and South Dakota on what the barriers were to improving grazing management. And the top barriers were capital, labor, and infrastructure particularly being water and fence. So the goal of virtual fencing then is to really transform manual labor into cognitive labor. And so with that, has everyone ever familiar with the invisible fence for dogs? Okay. That actually, Richard Peck was a salesman, and he, I shouldn't say fun fact or fun story, but he saw, as he was doing all his salesman stuff, saw a bunch of dead dogs on the road. And so that's how Invisible Fence was born, because he was like, we got to keep these puppies at home. And so the first patent for that came out in 1973. And by 1987, his company, the Invisible Fence Company, had installed 17,000 of those invisible fences across the country. And then moving forward into 1990, researchers used remote dog training collars to manage 4 Hereford steers. And this is an old paper from 1991. We won't get into whether there were diapers involved in my timeline at that point. Strong possibility. But in 1991, this paper came out in Rangelands, which is a peer-reviewed journal that's put out by the Society for Range Management, an alternative to fences. And if you notice here, this is a signal transmitter / receiver. They're low power requirement radio frequency devices mounted on portable poles. So as we go through the rest of my presentation and today, that very well mimics the base stations that the Vents company has. And then the device that the animal had was actually supposed to be a implant electrical stimulator in their nose. So kind of innovative ideas even back in the early 90s. And so today, I would say the work that we've done at SDSU, but also previous work, it's really been the last 5 to 10 years that virtual fencing has really taken off. And it started in 2015. A study was conducted. They had cattle wear a collar, and then there was also an above ground induction cable. And what they found was that the visual induction cable was actually the deterrent for keeping the cattle contained. But that study also came out of work that was conducted using the eShepherd collars out of Australia. They were kind of the first to the market a little bit, so to speak. SDSU had conversations with them early about 2018, 2019, and they were supposed to be doing their North American rollout at the time. COVID happened, and so that got delayed. And Cody Jorgensen will be talking about their experience using the eShepherd collars. They're a little bit different design from this right now, but Gallagher has now acquired Agersons, which was the company behind eShepherd. That makes complete sense, right, from expanding your company's horizons. And so those Gallagher investments started in 2016, and they actually acquired the company in 2021. No Fence is originated out of Norway. They started in 2011. They have collars for cattle and sheep and goats. As you notice on the collars, and we have some to pass around, they're all kind of similar in how they work, what they look like, but each company, of course, is a little bit different. And then Vents is the company that is probably kind of the most discussed in the United States. They started as a small startup in California of about like a 10 shop kind of guy. So a lot of nerds who like hadn't really been out like in the world. So we're going to forgive them for that because they have made advances in their collars, but still some kinks to work out. And as we mentioned, Jamie mentioned, you know, we are trying today to provide kind of unbiased, like the good and the bad of all the different companies and options that are available for virtual fencing. So sometimes when we do extension events or research things, you know, and bring up virtual fencing and how it could really improve grazing management on a landscape level scale, sometimes the feedback is like, well, like, you know, this is like a, you know, greenwashing thing, like you're trying to get rid of the cowboys and like the Western way of life. And none of the companies promote that. That's not anything that researchers are promoting. It's really kind of marrying tradition, like still checking your cattle, being out on horseback, on your four-wheeler, with some of these new advances that we have in precision ranching technologies. And so this is just an example of a C-Lock Smart Scale that we have out at Cottonwood. Just an example, we have this out where our steers have the virtual fence collars. And then, so not only can we see where they are, but this system is cloud connected. And so Jamie can log in at any time and see what any individual animal weighs at any given time. And they step onto the load cells with their front end, and there's a direct correlation between front end body weight and whole body weight. So instead of turning your cows out, getting a weight on them, picking them up at the end of the grazing season and getting a weight again, you actually are able to see real-time fluctuations as it corresponds to conditions. So that's just one example of kind of how all of this new technology can really be married together to have bigger impacts for producers in terms of how they're managing their animals. So most virtual fence companies function similarly. Corral is a startup out of Nebraska from a UNL grad who grew up on a ranch, and he started his own virtual fence company. They are just kind of kicking collars out and getting things going. But so that is another option if you are interested. Corral, just like you would spell it. Corral, the reason why I bring up Corral is that they do not have base stations associated with their collars. Everything is on the collar. This is for the vent system. So how it works is there's a three-way interaction between the software, the tower, or we call it a base station, and the collar, the virtual fence device that that animal wears on their neck. The base station functions off of cellular and solar. The solar panel is about 4x6 and is facing away from us here. And you can see all the grounding rods connected with it. I had Jamie and our other colleague Hector pound those in.
We have better place.
I was like, you guys look good. That's, yeah, you did it. It got done. Really glad I didn't have to do it. But really, virtual fencing is going to allow greater control over animal movement on the landscape. A common question that we get is, well, how far is the coverage? So when you work with any of the companies, again, our experience that we're talking about with SDSU is with vents, but you can see the two tower locations. The towers obviously go up on the highest point on your place, and they overlay cell reception. And you can see that kind of on the best line, we have 30 kilometers of coverage, which is about 18 miles. So fairly significant. It depends obviously on how big your operation is and the coverage that you have, how many towers that you need. One thing that I should bring up is that, because I forgot to put a slide in it, but the towers cost, last numbers we had are $12,500 each. And the collars are about $55 per head per year. With vents, you rent the collars. So if a collar falls off, as it does, and we will talk about that, you don't have to go and fish it out. Obviously, if you can find it, send it back, great. But it's not like you paid $200 for a collar, it goes missing, and you have to spend another $200 to get a new one. And every company kind of works a little bit differently, whether you like straight up buy the collars or it's a rental. So again, how most systems are working is that you have the base station, you have a virtual fence boundary here, and basically you allow animal movement in certain areas and you can exclude them from areas where you don't want them to go or where they shouldn't go. It first operates with an auditory cue, and you can visually hear it like when you're out in the pasture as she's approaching the virtual fence boundary. It goes beep, 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 beep. And it's like, girl, you need to turn around. And then there's always that one heifer, kind of like that sister-in-law or your mother-in-law in my instance, where she's just like, I'm going to ignore this. And she keeps going. Then she gets the electrical cue. Okay. And then as soon as she turns around and comes back, it releases off of her because she's doing what you want her to do, right? She's coming back into the virtual boundary. You can go into the systems and actually see individual animals, and you associate the vents collar in our instance with your ear tag number. So you know who's who, and it gives you like a relatively real-time location. And this is looking at, so this is kind of the brain of the base station is up there. And there's boating batteries essentially inside it. So pretty intense batteries. There's about 5 or 6 of them. And then this is the brains. These were collars that we had lined out to put on steers. And I'll talk about this in a minute and pass them out. But the vents collars up there, you can see the battery. When you get them, you have to remove that covering and put the battery in. And there is some assembly required with the actual collars themselves. So as you can see, again, this is no fence. This was an early version of eShepherd. It had a solar panel on the top to power it. What's the problem potentially with having a solar panel on something that your cow's wearing or your steer? Solar panels are like typically kind of like delicate flowers. And that can get covered up with poop. It can get jostled around, messed with, broken, right? And as soon as those cells get broken, you're going to have some problems. So they have Cody will show you that they've kind of changed their design a little bit with the eShepherd collar that he has. And then this is the current Vents collar. So Vents started out with version 1, which we don't have and thankfully never encountered, because Jorgensen's had the version 1, and it was kind of this like polyplastic, like flexible. So it would easily turn inside out. So what happens when your virtual fence collar turns inside out? And that's where the electrodes are. Good luck, right? It might as well be in your shed. It's not doing you any good. This is version 2. You'll notice that it has a webbing design. And so this came all in its beautiful little parts. And Logan spent a good majority of his graduate work early on putting these together. But so you had to adjust the webbing for each animal, which that takes a lot of time. This originally, for this version 2 collar on Vents, this sat on the side of their neck. And then you can see the electrodes here. And then these counterweights are actually dive weights. And I won't tell you what our UPS lady said when she had to bring in like 30 boxes of them. So, you know, shout out to our UPS drivers. They earn it. And then we can pass this around if you guys want to take a look and also feel how heavy that version 2 is. And then this is the version 3 collar. So this is what we have out at Cottonwood right now. So Vents calls this the cattle rider. I know. I'm like, we can do better. But it even has the animal wearing it etched into it. But so what's the benefit of having this chain design instead of the webbing? The chain is the whole electrode, right? So you no longer have these two, they're still here, right? But for the webbing collars, we would have problems with them turning inside out, flipping. And so that would mean you would have to bring animals back in and work them and fix it, right? And what happens, Bill, if if you keep twisting webbing and it keeps twisting, what happens? It gets tighter, right? It's like that. It's like the notch on your belt where you're like, oh, let's not get crazy. So we had problems with the webbing, like I said, turning inside out and then actually digging into the animal's necks. And those are images that we call not safe for work. So Jamie put together this video. Oh, we can pass this around. I forgot.
Something to notice on here. We'll talk about that. The housing's attached there.
Yes.
You'll show that there. This is actually our modification that we put on there to keep collars a little bit better. Where at one point they had shipped zip ties to keep the collar on the animal.
And then these plastic links here are the breakaway point from an animal welfare safety standpoint. But yeah, when we first got this version 3, they suggested these cable ties. And how well did that go?
As well as everybody expects.
And so Jamie MacGyvered, as he typically does, this bolt situation.
And so what we used last year was greatly increase our efficacy. That we basically just put a bolt with a lock nut on there and tighten that down really quick when they're on that animal. Pretty easy to get off too. You just got to sort of wrench there to them. But that lock nut holds up really well with that collar. So I would say that we probably had 130 steers, maybe 5 collars fell off total, which we blocked those. So probably about 5.
So we have this video here. Let's see if I can. Jamie put this together, but this is what putting the version 3 vents colors on looks like in practice. You guys aren't going to have sound, but you can see the plastic links there. And then an early suggestion from Vents was also these kind of shipping container cable ties. Instead of the zip ties, then it was this. And then, as we mentioned, Jamie modified and found out that those bolts work the best. And if you'll also note in the video, having a neck extender on your chute, I would say, is almost critical to putting any of these collars on. There's just way too much movement by the animal if you don't have that. And it makes it a heck of a lot easier having that neck extender on the chute. So you can see Jamie putting it on, and then he adjusts it and makes sure that it's good to go. And I would say when we first put them on, there was some learning curve in terms of what's too loose, what's too tight, what's just kind of right Goldilocks. But you can see then that version 3 collar, that cattle rider that they call, hangs down at the base of their neck as they move off. So with that brings up the collar retention rates. Again, these are SDSU numbers, so this will vary, you know, even if some of our other researchers and people presenting share their collar retention rates, it's going to be different just because of the learning curve associated with fitting the collars. The version 2 collars that we had out at Cottonwood in 21 had a 77% containment rate, or excuse me, this is supposed to say retention rate. So how many collars were actually retained? 77% of them were, of the ones that we put on. And again, that's with the webbing collar. The version 3 collars with the chains in 22, we had a 44% retention rate of the collars, which is like no bones, really bad. And obviously makes it really difficult then when you're trying to manage your animals, and particularly when you're doing a virtual fence research trial. You kind of need the collars to stay on. So those version 3 collars in 22, we did not have Loctite on the bolts on the back of that cattle rider. And we added those in 23. And as we mentioned, we did the bolts instead of kind of those cable ties, those shipping container closure zip ties. And so this last year, I forgot to mention, but it was up there, we had about a 90% retention rate of the collars with those modifications that Jamie was able to do. So when you go, again, this is specific to vents, but when you go into the system, this is what it can kind of look like when you set up your virtual fence boundaries. So this is setting up a rotation, but you can see we have pasture 2 paddocks, pasture 3, pasture 4, and then you can make your virtual fences. And in the system, you can tell it, okay, start paddock 1 at 8 a.m. on Thursday. And then on Friday at 5 p.m., turn off paddock 1 and turn on the next virtual fence for them to move into. So you can program it into the system. And this then is a time lapse of pasture use. So this is really showing GPS fixes. So when the collar connects to the base station and hits the software with where that animal is, you can see that we have the water labeled and also where our tower is. Because what's the one thing that is sometimes easy to forget about if you're designing virtual fence rotation in the software? Where your water is. And so you always have to make sure, of course, that they have access to that water. So that's why you label it within the system. So you can see, again, this was kind of a rotation moving through pasture 3. The other thing I want to mention is that another frequently asked question that we get is battery life. The GPS fixes that we get on the research side are every 5 minutes because we really want to know what those animals are doing, when and where. The events default is about a 30-minute GPS fix. So you get an updated location every 30 minutes. So the difference then in terms of battery life, right, is that if that tower and the collar, the base station and the collar have to continually communicate every 5 minutes, that really draws down your battery, right? Versus every half hour, you're going to have a longer battery life. So we've been able to get through the whole grazing season without needing to change the battery, but it is a consideration. And obviously, if you do have some animals that keep pushing the limits and their collar keeps getting pinged, then that draws down the battery as well. One of the good things, potential benefits with virtual fencing is that you can exclude or prevent their movement into different areas. So this is showing, this is a hard fence boundary. So we've got barbed wire there. And then this is we put up a virtual fence there to keep them. And you can see this is a heat map of the herd's movement. So this warmer colors indicate that that's where they spent more time in. So you can see that they go up to the virtual fence boundary and move around, but we don't in this instance have any animals that have crossed that boundary. Current research has demonstrated that you can use virtual fencing to exclude cattle from environmentally sensitive areas. A lot of this early work with excluding cattle focused on riparian areas, and again, was with the e-shepherd collars. But they looked at it for riparian areas and also protecting tree saplings. And they found that the cattle in those experiments really readily learned the virtual fence cues and primarily only needed the audio cue to stay contained and excluded from the area. And you see that their exclusion from the area was almost 100% of the trial period. The other question that comes up a lot when talking about virtual fencing is the stress impact on the animals and if that's going to impact their performance. There's a lot of ongoing research that other presenters today will talk about in terms of stress response. But 2019 study found that there was no difference in stress response or behavior between having a virtual fence and electric tape. And that was a 4-week trial. And to kind of quickly summarize Logan's research is that Logan looked at average daily gain. So like I mentioned and kind of showed you guys, we had those smart scales out in the pastures and we had animals. So all the animals in Logan's research had the virtual fence collar on so that we could get their location. But we did not turn on the auditory cue or the electrical cue on half of the animals. And those half were continuously grazed. So we just turned them out and left them in the pastures. And then the other half of the animals were virtually rotated. And so what Logan found was that there was no difference in average daily gain between continuous, so just turning them out, and rotationally grazing the animals with virtual fence. So that's good from a producer standpoint that if you do decide or are thinking of adopting this technology, that it likely won't impact your animal performance or your check at the end of the year too badly. Just some real life anecdotes for you is that Jamie received a grant last year and at the Society for Range Management in 23 in Boise, we had a really big in-service meeting. We had over 100 researchers and stakeholders that attended that meeting, which really, I think, speaks to the volume of that people are excited about this and are really trying to see where it works, when it works, and how it works, or how it doesn't work. But during SRM last year, a rancher in Idaho shared this anecdote that he, you know, it was the end of the grazing season, pretty rough country in northern Idaho. And so he was out on his allotment and he was going to gather up his animals at the end of the season. And, you know, they're out there riding for like a week. The animals do have a virtual fence, but like just extensive rangelands, right? And he can't find like 10 head. And he's like, and they're like, this is the last 10 head on earth that they need to find to bring home, right? And so he calls his wife and he's like, can you get into the vent system and, you know, tell me like where these head are? And she's like, oh, well, they're right there. Like they're right next to you. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, you know, we've been riding up and down like this area, like there's no way that they're in here. And sure as heck, they were down in the draw, like literally almost next to the guy. And he just like wasn't able to like visually see them, right? Or get his horses down there. But he was able to call his wife who could then tell him where those animals were located. And that obviously saved a lot of time. What's the other moral of that story? Your wife is always right. Okay. The other thing is we were talking with Forest Service, I think last summer, kind of about potentially doing some virtual fencing. And we were out with this producer that had been thinking about virtual fencing, and he was hemming and hawing about, you know, like it doesn't fit up putting the collars on when he works his cattle otherwise, then turn them out onto his allotment. So that brings up, right, like in order to utilize virtual fencing, you might have to work your cattle a little bit more often than you traditionally do, or you're going to have to figure out the time that you can collar the animals when you're already working them, right? So that's a consideration. But it was really interesting because he, you know, he was going on, he's like, well, I don't see the benefit of this. And then we're driving through his allotment and his bull is napping under a tree. And he's like, oh, that's where that guy is. And I'm like, if you had virtual fencing, you'd be able to like readily see where he is. And by the way, like he's totally not busy. Like that guy is not doing his job. Okay. But right, so there's some like real life anecdotes of the potential benefit of fitting virtual fencing into your system. I conducted a survey with Dr. Dana Hogue, who is a researcher at Colorado. And this was a survey with 31 producers across the US. Some like were not going to adopt virtual fencing. Some were already adopting it and had it installed, and some were thinking about it. And it was just really interesting. And I share these survey results because even though this is just kind of a snapshot, right, of like 30 some producers from across the country, they readily identified the most important benefits of adopting virtual fencing. So protecting environmentally sensitive areas, more effectively allocating your pastures, putting fences where you previously couldn't. I think you all have situations of that where it's like, oh, I wish I could put a fence there, but time, labor, money, circumstances aren't going to allow it. But also looking at labor savings and actually being able to account and have information on your individual animals. They also identify the most important barriers to adoption. So technical factors, reliability, economic feasibility, public and ethical concerns, and if excessive training is needed. You know, not all producers have a wonderful daughter that they can call, you know, to tell them how to work their cell phone or their virtual fence system. So that is something to consider, right, when thinking about virtual fencing. Of course, cost came up a lot in talking with these producers from across the country, and Logan's going to go over into the economics of virtual fencing. But the other thing is, how many of you producers in the room actually put a dollar value on like an hourly wage for yourself? No one, right? But if you were to actually do that and look at the cost benefits in terms of labor for traditional fencing versus virtual fencing, it is kind of interesting what the economics do. And again, you know, if you're saving labor on fencing, you can now start to use that labor for other productive ways, right? Like maybe it's hedging cattle, maybe it's having more closely monitored animal health. Again, the concept of virtual fencing is that you're not removing the cowboy from the landscape, you're just changing the job that he's doing. So instead of doing the $15 or $20 an hour jobs, now you guys can do the $100 an hour jobs that really have a really big impact on your bottom line. And this one producer was quoted, you know, that in 4 hours, he could build an entire season worth of fencing on the computer. Heck of a lot more fun than one person driving around in a pickup all day to repair a fence. And I think we all can relate to that. And as I mentioned, and Jamie and I kind of alluded to, is that producers are so innovative, those of you in the room. And so again, if you have any ideas for research questions that you think or need to be asked, let us know. But these producers that we interviewed came up with 52 recommendations for improving the vent system in particular. So improving the interface, improving the collars, making them water resistant. If a gray collar falls off in your corn stalks or in your range, what do you think the likelihood of finding that is? Like none. The thing needs to be like hot Barbie pink or blue, yellow, orange, whatever your highlighter color preference is. But also the producers that we interviewed had some advice of getting tech savvy labor. And again, you really need to consider, yes, virtual fencing is kind of this like awesome, sexy new technology and everyone's excited about it. And it can do a lot of good on the landscape, but you first and foremost need to think of if it actually fits your management goals. And one more thing to bring up is that the producers we interviewed didn't very often bring up privacy concerns, but there are things that you guys as producers and partners need to think about in the room in terms of potential data breaches and government access. There are some concerns in kind of the virtual fencing kind of conversations about that the data used about where animals are on grazing allotments could be used against producers to remove cattle from the landscape. So you can see the quotes from producers there. One producer in particular was very concerned about political motivation to get cattle off of public grazing lands. So ultimately, virtual fencing technology is changing quickly. We showed you the different versions of the fence collars. The costs really come down to the scale at which you're going to use it. And what was interesting from the survey is that producers without virtual fencing have concerns that producers with virtual fencing have overcome. So again, I think it's really important that all of us in this room, producers, stakeholders, partners, talk to each other about what's working and what's not working, because that's really how we're going to affect change on the landscape. And again, really this concept of innovative ideas and practices. So potential future applications of virtual fencing, if you have a grazing co-op or grazing association, you all could go in and buy the towers, cover the grazing association's acres, and then everyone is responsible for buying their individual set of collars, and it can all run off of the same software system. Flirts, sheep and cattle, livestock integration, protecting critical breeding grounds for like sage grouse, wildfire mitigation. If you think in California, if we could use virtual fencing to get cattle up under that understory and remove a lot of that fuel, things might be a lot different for California. And really the possibilities are endless. With Merck acquiring vents, obviously there's going to be some animal health things that are probably coming down the pike for the collars, in terms of potentially detecting estrus, breeding, things like that. And also carbon credits, right? That's also been a pretty hot topic. If you can demonstrate to a company that is going to pay you for carbon credits, that you're rotating your animals on the landscape, they're not in any one area at any given time, you then have the data to validate that you are properly managing your animals to create carbon sequestration. And so with that, I'm out of time. Oh, one thing though, can I mention this quick that I forgot?
Well said.
Okay, that's not going to happen. Is that another question that we get? You know, I gave the example, like if they go down into the draw, and so it's no longer line of sight with the base station, right? So your cattle are still contained, but if you, while they were down in the draw, go in and create a new virtual fence rotation for them to move into, they don't get that virtual fence, the new fence that you created, until they come back up out of the draw and get in contact again with the base station. Does that make sense? So just one last thing on how it works. And I think that we have Cody next. Thanks, guys.
Let's give Krista a round of applause. Thanks, Krista.